This is my farm.
Don't come out here and tell me what I need.
I need solutions that work and market options that are worth my time.
Small town support that sees the bigger picture.
A global network that empowers us. A co-op that's there for us every day.
Thank you for joining us for our Agri-Pulse Washington Week in Review. I'm Spencer Chase, and we're doing something a little bit different this week. Joined as always by Agri-Pulse's Phil Brasher, but also South Dakota Senator John Thune here to discuss the USDA aid package as well as some other comings and goings in farm policy. So we certainly appreciate Senator Thune making a little bit of time for us. And as I mentioned, Senator, a lot of the talk over the last week since USDA rolled out this aid package, this $19 billion in total, $3 billion in purchases and commodity purchases, and $16 billion in direct payments. Obviously, a lot of the talk has been, what is this aid package going to look like? A lot of lingering questions. But I guess before we dive too deep on this, just kind of your initial reaction to what we know so far and what the Department of Agriculture has put forth in terms of the assistance they plan to provide to farmers and ranchers.
Okay, good. Well, yeah, thanks, Spencer and Phil. Good to be with you both. Yeah, I mean, we're paying very close attention, obviously, to this. We had hoped initially in the CARES package to have higher level of funding. We started out at a $30 billion number for CCC and then $20 billion on top of that, and it got ratcheted down. Schumer and the Democrats kind of pulled it down to where it ended up being $14 billion for CCC, $9.5 billion for disaster assistance. The $14 billion in the CCC won't be available until July 1. Presumably that'll be used for MFP payments or something that'll be needed later this year. But they did find an additional, they had $6.5 billion funds in CCC, which they combined with the 9.5, put together a $16 billion aid package. And as you pointed out, $3 billion on top of that for food assistance. And so of the $16 billion, though, the way they broke it down, I got a call Friday, a week ago in the afternoon, that they were going to be announcing this at the president's news conference, he and Secretary Perdue, and kind of gave me the outline, dimensions of the program, what it would look like, and kind of an idea about how it would be distributed, which I think is still a work in progress. But we're following that carefully. Obviously, we got a lot of economic hardship out here in farm country, livestock producers in particular. Those prices weren't good, and then since COVID, they've just kind of been a downward spiral. And so they're really in the tank, and we're hoping that these dollars that have been being allocated can provide at least some temporary relief. My guess is it's possible we may have to do more later this year, but we're working with the USDA. They're writing rules and regulations and getting input and trying to fashion the final package.
Senator, we obviously still don't know some of the details on these payments, how they'll be made, levels and so forth, rules around them. But what we are hearing is that there are going to be payment limits, $125,000 per commodity, $250,000 total per farmer. But there's been a lot of pushback on that in the last few days from the dairy industry, some other groups, pork, fruit and vegetable growers out in the West in California. Letters have been going to the White House from the House side, from the Senate, saying we should not have payment limits on this. It'll wind up hurting a lot of the larger operations that are hurting just as much as smaller farms. What do you think the prospect? What's your own feeling about whether there should be payment limits, and what do you think USDA is going to ultimately do here?
Well, as you guys who have been covering ag policy for a long time know, there's nothing that divides agriculture better than a debate about payment limits. And that's certainly the case here. As you pointed out, Phil, there are a number of farm organizations, add to that list the National Farm Bureau, who are now advocating against payment limits in this. And then there are a number of farm organizations who are saying, we think they ought to stay in place. And it's kind of reflected in the representation in Congress too. As you point out, a number of my colleagues I'm aware of, at least on the Senate side, and I guess on the House as well, who are sending letters now saying, don't include payment limits. And it kind of comes down to where you've been on payment limits in the past. Every year in the Farm Bill, we have a debate and an amendment, usually at the Ag Committee level, and then eventually if we have a debate on the floor about payment limits. I've historically been most of the time in favor of payment limits, and I did not sign on the letter to the White House this time. One of the reasons for that is there's a finite amount of money here, and if you take the payment limits off, obviously it doesn't go as far, and so the amount per head probably goes down significantly. So I'm not wading into that debate, so to speak, but I'm certainly, I guess, cognizant of the fact that we have a certain amount of money to play with. And, if you lift the payment limits and more go to bigger operators, that means less goes probably to some of the other folks. And that's a challenge we're going to face. So I think where they are at $125,000 per commodity and $250,000 per entity or individual, I'm okay with that. We'll see what they come up with, and I don't think at this point we know exactly what that's going to look like.
We've also seen some language from the department, and I guess I should correct myself. We haven't technically seen this language from the department. We're working off of info provided by one of your colleagues, as a matter of fact, saying that there's an April 15th point where the level of support for these covered losses is going to switch from 85% prior to that April 15th date and then down to 30% afterward. We've seen some concerns about that as well. In fact, I had a lobbyist tell me yesterday that we're still seeing mounting losses, and so putting a hard stop on something like this in the middle of a pandemic was making some folks scratch their head. I guess your initial thoughts on the potential for that April 15th cutoff date, as well as any potential flexibility you might be asking the department to leverage here.
Right, and I think we're hoping the department will be flexible on that date. They were looking for a window, and I think they were trying to determine price loss over a period of time related to the COVID virus. But as we've seen, it hasn't bottomed out. I mean, we continue the prices continue. We continue to see, as I said, this downward spiral. And my impression, at least, is that they're kind of grappling with, not only the issue of payment limits, the amount attached to the percentage of the price loss that you would get on a per head basis per animal, but also perhaps those dates. And the parameters, I think, are still a little bit open to negotiation, I guess I would say, Spencer. And yes, we are working with USDA. We want to make the program work as effectively as possible. And there has been some pushback from, I think, some of the organizations out there about whether or not, why is the April 15th? That seems kind of arbitrary. And here we are already almost into May. So I don't think any of those things are fully decided yet. USDA has to write the rules. They have to go to OMB and be approved. We're hoping there will be a sign-up period sometime in the early to mid-May, and then payments would start going out late May to early June. But at this point, I would say all those things are still kind of points of negotiation. Nothing has been, at least to my knowledge, I know there's a lot of discussion around it, but nothing's been decided.
Senator, some are reading that April 15th, that drop in compensation as a indication that USDA is planning a second tranche and is assuming that a second tranche is going to be needed to fully cover the losses from the coronavirus-related losses. Are we going to need another package of another authorization of additional aid to spending to USDA? You mentioned the $14 billion additional becomes available to them in July. We now have House members proposing an additional $50 billion as part of the whatever your next stimulus bill is. So what is next, and how much is the USDA going to need?
Yeah, I think, Philip, the USDA would obviously welcome additional funding. As I've talked with them about how they're structuring this current package, it's all based on the amount of money they have to work with. And so as they try and design it, they're trying to design something that will deliver the maximum amount of relief and help on the, like you said, the finite amount of money that they have. But they've indicated, as have a lot of my colleagues in Congress, that there's probably going to be a need to do some more at some point. They had been talking about a two-pronged approach with what they have to work with right now. One that would encompass that first time frame, a second factor that would go into losses that are incurred beyond that date. And so I've seen a number of ideas or proposals around that, and I hope that they can come up with something that's workable. I guess that's what I would say. But it all depends on This is the top line number we have to work with. This is what we have to fit into it. And my guess is there will be requests, and probably if there is another phase of this, there's probably going to have to be some additional funding put into the pipeline to deal with it. But they're doing, I think, the best they can right now with what they have in hand, which is why they added the $6.5 billion from the CCC to make this a $16 billion package.
Yeah. Speaking of next steps, the president just signed into law this bill that replenishes the Paycheck Protection Program, that forgivable loan program that's been so popular for small businesses. A lot of farms have gotten involved with. Also made farms eligible for the disaster program at SBA. Is that going to be enough for the PPP program? The CEO of the Farm Credit Council, Todd Van Hoos, said he expects that could be that money could run out in a few days. Are you going to be able to come back and put even more money into that?
Possibility that we will have to do that. If that happens, I think it'll happen after the 4th of May. I don't think anything more is going to happen by unanimous consent. I think we've kind of run the gamut on what we can do by consent. So any additional funding for that will have to be voted on, I think, by the full Congress when we return. But it is, they're burning through it at a high clip. I mean, it is heavily subscribed to. A lot of interest, and farmers and ranchers are eligible for PPP, as you mentioned, and now also for the EIDL loans as well. And in South Dakota, there was a report about the first tranche of money that went out after they ran out of it, and where it had gone, and which states had benefited. In our state in South Dakota, interestingly enough, we'd had over 11,000 businesses who had gotten loans to the tune of about $1.4 billion, and that put us, according to this study, Bloomberg was reporting on it, but we were at 77% of full payroll for that time period. So, at some point you think you're going to start to max out, that we're going to have to cover the entire payroll in the country for the next 8 weeks. But I do know that it's going really fast, high level of demand, and who knows how long this lasts, this current round. But I wouldn't be surprised if we're back at it, if there's still applications in the pipeline and they're eligible and qualified, whether or not even the additional $310 billion that we just authorized earlier this week will be enough.
Mm-hmm. Senator, we know your time is valuable, and we want to thank you for spending some of it with us. But before we let you go, we'd probably be remiss if we did not ask about a situation unfolding in your hometown, as well as a number of other hometowns in the country, as we look at this issue of processing capacity in the protein sector. Obviously, the Smithfield plant in Sioux Falls shut down, a number of plants in Iowa. There was a plant in southern Minnesota, a plant in Colorado has been shut down. Folks all over the country are sort of looking for places to take their animals, and meatpacking plant employees across the country are wondering if they can maybe get some frontline consideration for getting some personal protective equipment. I guess I just wonder, kind of broadly speaking, what do you see as the role of the United States Senate and Congress more broadly in looking at this issue of, packer processing capacity and the health and safety of packing plant employees?
I think the role of the Congress in this case, Spencer, is an oversight role, and it's to make sure that we've got a supply chain for food, reliable food chain in this country. And that's one thing that this country has always had, is quality, safe, in most cases affordable food, and we want to keep that. And the idea that some of these plants can start closing creates a lot of disruption out there, and it's not just at the supermarket as yet. But if you have 550 hog farmers here in South Dakota and the region who now have no place to take their animals, and all that product gets out of the supply chain, we start seeing that in Worthington and Waterloo, or in Greeley, which is beef, but same set of circumstances. If that becomes the pattern around the country, this could get real problematic in terms of the supply chain. So the situation here, obviously the first priority is the safety and health of the workers there. CDC has been in here. They've made recommendations. I've looked at those. I know that Smithfield has looked at them. And I think the goal is to figure out a way to keep these workers safe. And PPE is a big part of that. I think testing is a big part of that. I've suggested that to the company. to others. But we had a conversation with Sonny Perdue 2 days ago, where a number of us raised this issue about supply chain and processing plants closing because of COVID, et cetera. And testing was a big issue. PPE was a big issue, but also putting in place some practices that can protect people, make sure we're doing everything we can to keep workers safe, but not keep these plants shut down, which again creates all kinds of problems. I mean, there's no place else to go here. I mean, it's not like you can, they're at capacity down in Sioux City, and we just don't have options. And I think you hate to see animals being euthanized because we can't get them harvested. And that's kind of where we're headed if we can't figure this out. So I think it's really important. And he was, he emphatic, the secretary, he's been working with the White House, with the companies to try and put in place some of these practices and guidelines that will enable these plants to open up again, hopefully, and continue to maintain a safe place to work for their workers.
Mm-hmm. Well, and you had mentioned the possibility of a prospect of a potential other round of assistance going forward, but there's been a lot of folks kind of wondering where their assistance is going to come from. A lot of folks are worried about the health and safety of the packing plant operations at this point, but also ethanol plants, wondering if they could have maybe gotten into this round of assistance. Any kind of expansion on the just the amount of folks that can be expecting assistance that you might anticipate in any potential round of legislation to come?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we add to the funding authority that's already been authorized, then my guess is, and we did, I mean, I wrote a letter along with others asking to cover ethanol plants in this because, I mean, we got about half of them are idled. And, we got about half of the annual production now it's completely gone. We had a tremendous amount of demand destruction as a result of the COVID virus. And that has a lot of implications, not just for the plants and the workers and all, the people who are directly affected, but for all the farmers who sell there. I mean, we grow about 800 million bushels of corn a year in South Dakota. 450 million of that goes into ethanol plants. So it's the number one market for South Dakota corn, and corn is the number one commodity in South Dakota, and agriculture is our number one industry. So this stuff all matters to us. It's all part of that chain, and it's all about being able to market the commodities we raise and grow in a way that enhances not only the profitability of agriculture, but it also helps with the fuel supply around the country and around the world. There are a number of things the ethanol plants are suggesting that things that we could be doing, but one of which would be to get some direct assistance through the CCC funds that are being made available. And that is something we've advocated for, and we'll see in the next round what we might be able to do.
South Dakota Senator John Thune, a longtime member of the Senate Agriculture Committee. We certainly appreciate you taking a little bit of time to join us here on Agri-Pulse's Washington Week in Review.
Good to be with you, Spencer. Phil, you too. Thank you. Stay safe, guys.
Thanks. You as well, Senator.
Good.
Okay.